Today is July the 14th, 2004. You know, I was born on July the 25th, 1912, and so I'm this year 92 years old. So I've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of things happen in my life. And Mother and I, Violet and I, who has passed away in 2002, during the years, 69 years that we were married, we gathered a lot of family history and a lot of family genealogy. We did it on our own and in conjunction with other members of the family and family organizations. We compiled a lot of records. And so today, I'd like to put on this tape just a little outline of some of the things that we have done. In 1912, my parents lived in that homestead. We lived there for 7 years. There was a Homestead Act that allowed people who wanted 160 acres of land to file on it and build a cabin and plow 10 acres of ground and get it into something, and to live there 4 years, and at the end of 4 years they had the title to the land. And so in 1907, my parents filed on that homestead. Well, they'd had run into some hard luck when they came from Wyoming. They filed on some land that was under irrigation, and my father came down with typhoid fever in the winter, and they had to move into town to stay with my grandfather and grandmother. And at that time, someone else came in and filed on top of it because they weren't there. And so they lost their farm. But anyway, we lived there, and that's me in the baby buggy, and that was our sole possessions. My brothers lived in a tent, 2 older brothers, and they wasn't much older than me. And I don't know whether my sister lived there or not, stayed there, but the house was about, I think it probably about 20 by 18 or something like that. It just wasn't very big. And we lived there for 7 years until we finally acquired enough means to get away from there. And so that's a kind of a story of our homestead. This is a picture of my grandfather and grandmother, John Cyrus Dewey, and that was their 50th wedding anniversary picture, and it was taken in Emmett, Idaho. This is a picture of my grandfather and grandmother's home in Fairview, Wyoming, and this was taken at my mother and father's wedding party after the wedding, and that's them standing in front of the window. And this is a picture of my father and mother's wedding day in Fairview, Wyoming. They were married in the Logan Temple at Logan, Utah, in about 1900. This is a picture of my mother on her 18th birthday, taken in Grover, Wyoming. This is Violet and I's 60th wedding anniversary picture, taken here in Prescott, Arizona. Now this is a book we put together of the history of the Emmett Valley. My grandparents were some of the first pioneers that came to the valley, and my own mother and father came in about 1903 from Star Valley, Wyoming. This is a picture of Emmett Valley at the present time. It is a beautiful valley with a beautiful river running down the center of it. The slopes around the bottom of the valley were covered with all kinds of fruit trees. It was really a wonderful place to live. This is a picture of the surrounding hills around the valley. The first pioneers had to slide their wagon down the hill to get into the valley. You can see the long ridges, and my grandparents, they rough locked the wheels. That is, they tied the front wheel and the back wheels together on both sides and slid their wagon down the hill to get into the valley. April 1908, my grandfather was on the fire department of the city of Emmett, and the town caught on fire, and the buildings burned, including an old hotel. And my grandfather went into the hotel when it was on fire and picked up a clock and saved it from being burned. After a while, the proprietor came up to my granddad, and Granddad offered him the clock. He said, "I got your clock out." And the fellow said, "You mean that you spent your time getting that clock out and let good whiskey burn?" And he said, Granddad, he said, "Well, I'll tell you what," he said, "I don't have any place to put it." But he said, "Take it home." And he said, "When I get another saloon, I'll come and get it." And he never did. And I have this clock, and it's hanging on the wall upstairs here in our lovely home. This is a book called Memories from Star Valley, Wyoming. My grandparents, both my mother's parents and my father's parents and his grandparents, and his grandmother's father and mother, were among the first of the settlers to go into Star Valley, Wyoming. And so we have gathered up all of the information we can on the history of Star Valley, Wyoming, and the problems that they had there. The first winter after they arrived, the weather was nice, and first year or two, and they built up quite a nice herd of cattle. On the third year, they had some bad snowstorms, and they didn't have enough hay, and most of their cattle died. And it was a trying time for the people there. My grandfather, Thurman, moved into the valley. He took up a homestead, which is 160 acres, and he plowed a furrow around 40 acres of it, and he cut it up into building lots, and he offered a building lot with a garden spot for anyone who would come there and live. And so this is how the town of Grover was started. My grandpa giving the town site to anyone who would build a home there. Now, the town was called Grover because a boy by the name of Grover was struck by lightning out there in that area, and they named the town for him. Now my father and mother my grandfather and grandmother and grandpa and grandma Child came down the valley down Crow Creek, and they settled at a place they called Fairview, right at the mouth of the canyon. And Grandpa Dewey plowed the first furrow and brought the first irrigation down into the valley there in Fairview, Wyoming. And so that's part of his history. I think most of you have a copy, that is of the first generation anyway, that Mother and I have put together, which is a brief history of our own family and the experience that we have had in that area of Emmett and here in Prescott. We also have included 10 generations of genealogy here of our family, which might be of importance to you. Now this is a picture of the Emmett Valley, and this is a book which was compiled by several of the fruit growers in Emmett, entitled Emmett Fruitful Land, or Idaho Fruitful Land. And on the back we have also the picture of the orchards in the big canal that runs down the edge of the valley to give us water. I have here a history of Deweyville. Now this is a town that my grandfather Dewey settled in about 1858, I believe it was. No, it was prior to that time, because the railroad came through, I think, in 1858, and grandfather was already there. He was the northmost settler in the valley. He was 20 miles, or just about 20 miles north of Brigham City. And he settled on a beautiful little pond, a little lake that existed there. And they called the town Deweyville. And this ranch remained in the hands of the family until just last spring, when Virginia Blackham, who was the last member of the family, passed away and the farm was sold. Now this is a picture of a tree that has a story behind it. During about the time that the railroad came through, at Promontory Point, which was just a few miles from there, where the two railroads met, my grandfather was hauling a load of lumber from Brigham City, which is about 19 miles away, to their home in Deweyville. And I don't know whether he was driving oxen or horses, but he broke a limb of a cottonwood tree and stuck it in when he got there, he used it to whip his horses and keep them going. And when he got there, instead of throwing it away, he stuck it in the ground right by that lake. You can see that pond there. And it was just an ideal place for it to grow. And so this was taken last year. You can see how large the tree was. This was Brooks Elzikar, which is one of my great-grandsons. And he was standing by the tree, and you can see just how large it was. Now this is a picture of the tree itself. I took 3 pictures to get in the height of it. There's 1, 2, and 3 up here, and I put them together. And the tree must be 100 feet tall. And I thought it was interesting to tell you that it was about at least 130 years old. This is a journal of Charles Alvin Thurman, who was my mother's younger brother. And no, he was mother's older brother. Grandpa Thurman had a mail contract to carry the mail from Mountain Home, Idaho to Rocky Bar, which was a mining town 70 miles from Mountain Home, Idaho. And Uncle Charlie kept a journal of their activities there at this mining town. My mother and her sister kept one of the relay stations. Her mother was about 16 years old, and her sister was 16 years old. They were twins, except they had different mothers. And Uncle Charlie kept a record of day-to-day travels of his experiences, not only when he was in Mountain Home, but his whole life. This is the history of the Elijah Knapp Fuller. Elijah Knapp Fuller was my mother's, was not my mother's, but Violet's great-grandfather. And this book is compiled not only of his descendants, of which we have our part in it. This is the history Elijah Knapp Fuller and his ancestors, which is a very, very interesting book to have. Now, this is a history of my family, the Child and the Rawson and the Coffin and the Holsclaw family. And it's a great big book, as you can see, that covers the experiences and the genealogy and these different families. This book covers the ancestry and the families of John Walker, who was one of Violet's most interesting ancestors. And this is the book of William Holmes Walker, who was also one of our ancestors. Several members of my family have asked that I put together some brief outlines of some of the history of some of their ancestors, where they came from, why they came here, and what part they played in the development of the Americas. And so I have fixed up these little folder books, and I've taken excerpts from the books, and I have compiled this information for you. And I'll just review a little of it. I got it backwards here. Don't have it on right. It covers the genealogy of your ancestor here. It is going back to 1498 or 1470, and so I've included in here the genealogy, which might be of interest to you. We also have here for you the pictures and some of the story of your pilgrim ancestors who came on the Mayflower. Now, Edward Fuller was one of the signers of the Mayflower Compact. He and his wife came to America, of course, for religious reasons. And the mother and father died the first winter they were here in America, and left a son by the name of Samuel, who married Jane Lathrop, who was the daughter of one of the great religious leaders of the time. I have included in here the history and the ancestors of Elijah Knapp Fuller, who was the descendant of Samuel Fuller, who came on the Mayflower. And it gives quite a comprehensive story in here of the problems that the Mayflower people went through the first winter. Even though half of them died, the rest of them, not a one, would go back. They wanted to remain here in America. And so I've included here the history of this group of people, it including the Puritans, which they were, which was a religious sect at the time. And so I have quite a little information that might be of interest to you of this family. I have also included the life of Elijah Knapp Fuller, who married Catherine Walker, who was the other family that I was talking about. So we have here the ancestry of the Fuller family. Not only that, I have included in here the Lathrop family. Now, John Lathrop was the one who started the first independent church in London when they broke away from the Catholic Church. I mean the Church of England. He was put in the old Clink prison at Newgate and was there for 4 years, I believe, and for practicing religion contrary to the Church of England. At the end of that time, his wife was ill, and he was allowed to get out to take care of his wife and starving family, and uh, his wife and his starving family, and he took this opportunity to escape to America. Now, he was one of the most interesting characters because from his family came some of the most distinguished people in America, descendants of John Lathrop. Now, I told you before that Jane Lathrop married Samuel Fuller, and I've listed in here the descendants of this family, a cousin relationship. Among them was Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Oliver Cowdery, one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, of the restoration of the gospel. Wilford Woodruff, who was one of the presidents of the church. Parley Pratt and Orson Pratt, who were among the first of the general authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And also I have here other descendants. Harold B. Lee, who was president of the church the 11th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Wilford Woodruff, who was another president of the church. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the 32nd president of the United States, and Thomas Edmund Dewey, who ran for governor of New York and was a presidential candidate. And then there was Adlai Ewing Stevenson, who was a U.S. senator. There was Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court judge, Ulysses Simpson Grant, the 18th President of the United States, and Parley P. Pratt, and as I listed on the other family, and George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan, and Mitt Romney, who is the present governor of Michigan. And then, of course, there's you, the descendants of John Lathrop, with all of these noble people as your kinfolk. And I have here the genealogical record of these people, and they'll be most interesting for you to read. Not only that, then these ones I have listed are Violet's family. And now the next person of importance who was one of my ancestors was Edward Rawson. He was the grandfather of the secretary and of the merchant dealing with silks and woolen goods. And he came to America and became the secretary of the Massachusetts Bay Company. And he served that for many years. You'll have to read this to really get the picture of it. I also have his picture here somewhere, whether it is correct or not. But there are some very interesting stories. To go with this. Now, our descendant from was Horace Strong Rawson, and I also have included his history. He was my great-great-grandfather, and he has left a journal with an account of his own life's history. I also have a history here of the Child family. They were some of the early pioneers that came to America. They didn't go in the Mayflower, but they came for own personal reasons. I believe they were adventurers that come to kind of, open up a new world. This book here is a record of the Rawson family and the record of Sarah Yorinda Rawson Child, who was my great-great-grandmother. And there were some very interesting stories in there of her life, which I'll put in this other record for you. So this is the picture of Sarah Yorinda Rawson Child, who was my great-great-grandmother. Now this here is a record that Violet, your great-grandmother, compiled, the record of the Rogerson and the Smith and the families and her ancestors and their families, which is contained in here, which contains a world of information on that part of the family.
Now we've recorded your ancestors, and we were very interested to hear all about your early ancestors. Now, what about your family, the Dewey family? How did they become acquainted with the church?
Well, Carol, my great-grandfather, John Cook Dewey was his name, and was born in England. He was an illegitimate child of Eliza Dewey, which was a spinster, recorded on his birth certificate. And in England at that time, and I guess any time, a child born out of wedlock didn't have any status. And so he was put to emptying the latrines and working on the streets. And he didn't, they didn't have any social standing at all. They were just outcasts, so to speak. And while he and his friend were working at this type of work, a couple of Mormon missionaries came. They were holding street meetings. They get on the street corner and get on a box and start telling about the gospel. And these two boys became interested in them, and these missionaries told them that they weren't bastards, that's what they called them at that time, that they were children of God, and that they had a great potential. And so these two boys joined the church. His mother was very upset about it, and so these two boys decided to come to America and join with the LDS people going west at that time. And so they signed on as helpers on a ship to go to New Orleans. And they were about 16 years old. When they came to New Orleans, in order to earn their way, why they started working wherever they could, traveling up the Mississippi. They had an opportunity to cut down some trees for wood or logs, and a log fell on his friend and killed him. And so that left my great-grandfather alone, 16 years old, with no particular friends unless he could find the church. And so he worked his way up to where the pioneers were traveling west, and he signed on as a wagon, driving a team on a wagon train and hauling goods or supplies to the west. And as a boy, and he made 2 trips there before he settled. And later, as he grew older, why he settled in northern Utah, and it was a place they called Emphy Springs. It was where the water came out of the ground, about 60 minor inches came out of the ground at one spot, and there was a little lake there, and he bought this, or acquired it some way, and he was the northmost settler in the Salt Lake Valley at that time. And that ranch has remained in the family for up until just this last year, when the last member of the family passed away, and the heirs didn't want to go farming, and so they sold the place.
Did his mother ever come over, or did she?
No, no, he was separated entirely from his family at that time. But at a later date, he had some half-brothers, and he paid the way for one of his half-brothers to come to America. And my father was acquainted with his half-brother at that time. And so, but anyway, this, when he joined with the church, and then he became involved in all of the activities of the church, you know. In a church, you know, there's no paid ministry, and anyone who is called to serve is just called to leave their whatever they have and go do whatever the Lord wants them to do. And he was called to be the bishop, first bishop of this little town they called Deweyville. And it's still there on the map, and I wish I had that tree. I have a picture of it down there. But anyway, he married a Rawson girl, who was a descendant of Edward Rawson, who was the secretary of the Massachusetts Bay Company. And she was the mother of my father, my grandfather. And about that time, in about 1856, why they were having problems with the government. Okay, now this is a map of the United States in 1846, and you'll note that all of this property here, which was California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah, was Mexican territory. And while they were, the Saints were coming west, they started here at Council Bluffs, and they made this streak westward. Even before they got there, after they left Nauvoo, Illinois, why the government came to them. Now this is after the Latter-day Saints had been driven out of their homes in Nauvoo, and they were just, you know, out on the road. And the government came to them, and they were having war with Mexico down here. And down here in Mexico, and they were trying to establish a border between the United States and Mexico. And so they asked for 500 of their best men, their youngest men, to fight the war with Mexico. And so they formed what they called the Mormon Battalion, and they walked 2,000 miles from Council Bluffs here, clear down here, and crossed, and this is the border between Mexico and the United States, and they wound up in San Bernardino, California. And they claimed this then, the Latter-day Saint people, for the United States. But in order to hold it, they had to establish colonies. And so after they had come west and settled in the Salt Lake area, why then they established more than 300 colonies from down in California over up to San Francisco, and all in Arizona and Nevada. They established colonies and claimed this for the United States of America. Well, what happened, the politicians that they sent out, they didn't like the way the Mormons were running the government there. They didn't allow saloons and none of the amenities, whatever, you know, that the old pioneer travelers wanted, and so they claimed, the governor or the court, I think they sent judges out there, U.S. judges, and they thought that Brigham Young was going to succeed from the Union. And so they came back and went back to Washington. They weren't very well received, you know, at least by the Latter-day Saints. And so what happened, they went back, and Buchanan sent 1/3 of the United States Army out here to quell this Mormon uprising. And you can imagine how it was 10 years after they had settled there in 1846. And you can imagine how these people felt here. The army coming to put down the uprising. There wasn't any uprising. And they were just trying to establish this as a part of America. And so they called for, I think there's more than 2,500 of soldiers that they sent west to quell this Mormon uprising. Well, they didn't know that the Mormons had been over the trail before, and so they knew what to do to stop the army. And so my great-grandfather Dewey and his father-in-law, Orville Child, they went back to stop this army from coming. And so in order to do this, they had 2,000 head of animals, the army did, mules and so forth. And so what this group did, some 350 volunteers, of which Grandpa Dewey was one of them, went back to stop this army, and his assignment was to burn the feet ahead of the army. Well, the army, without any feet to their horses, they couldn't go on. And Grandpa Child, he was in the back, and he was with the group that burned the wagon trains. And so it left the army stuck out there in the fall of the year without any food for their horses and without any supplies, so they had to stop there. And so before the next spring came, the army was in real trouble. They didn't have supplies, and the LDS people had they'd prepared for their coming. They'd been driven from their homes 5 times, and they weren't going to go through this again. And so they put tinder, straw in their houses. They were going to burn it to the ground if the army got through. But when they finally reached a settlement, and they agreed to let the army come, provide they'd camp 30 miles away from Salt Lake and not interfere with the people there. And Brigham Young was the governor at that time, but he resigned as governor and became, they sent a governor in to take his place. And so that was what happened just 10 years after the Latter-day Saints came west. And so that was one of the things Grandpa Dewey, my great-grandfather, participated in, was stopping of that army. It was kind of an interesting story. They slipped in, they burned the feed, and then they decided they'd run off the government mules. And they, in the morning hours, they got in behind this bunch of mules and was driving them away. And they didn't know that they had grain to feed the mules. They just called them in by blowing a bugle, and the mules would know they'd get their grain. And so they were driving these mules, and all at once, this old bugler blew the bugle, and these mules come stampede and run right through them, and got 12 of their horses and went back and joined the army. So that's one of the stories that great-grandpa's told, how embarrassed they were to lose some of their horses at that time.
How did your grandfather meet your grandmother?
Well, Granddad was just 16 years old, and they got the measles. And one of the remedies to break out the measles was to boil some what they call nanny berries and make a tea. And it would help break out the measles. I guess you know what nanny berries are, but cheap turds. They would. So there's a Indian camp across Bear River, and the child, my great grandfather's child, was a missionary there at the Indians, and they were there trying to teach them, you know, how to farm and how to live a better life. And my grandfather went over to get these nanny berries, and there he met my grandmother, and she was 15 years old. And I don't know how kind of a courtship they had, but that's how we met my grandmother, who was Sarah Ann Child. And they were married when he was 16, she was 15 years old. And they lived a very interesting life.
It must have been a hard life.
It was a hard life, but they didn't know the difference. Just like that homestead picture that I showed here at first. It was a hard life, you know, but it was a life like the rest of the people were living. And people just lived it. You know, no antibiotics, no way to treat diseases or anything else.
How many children did they have?
We had 10 children, Grandpa Dewey.
And did they all live, or?
No, some of them lived until they were teenagers, and 3 of them died from an epidemic that came through, an influenza. That illness took one of my uncles, you know, during the war, First World War. And so this was some of the kinds of problems they had to endure at that time. The saints, you know, Latter-day Saints were driven out of their homes 5 different times. The last time they left was from Nauvoo, Illinois. That was 4 years after the prophet was killed and his brother. The mobs increased in bitterness, and they determined to drive the Mormons out. And so these pictures show the kind of homes that they had to leave. They just walked out the door and left these beautiful homes to go out into the desert. And in the corner here is a picture of the temple, and they just finished it. And the last group that crossed the Mississippi River looked back, and they saw the temple flames coming out where some arsonists had set fire to the temple and burned it to the ground. Now this bottom is what they call Liberty Jail, and this is where Joseph Smith and his he was imprisoned one winter in that, and there's a dungeon in the bottom where they put their feet down through a hole in the floor, and they lived there through the cold months, sleeping on straw. And this is when they were driven out of Missouri and went back to Nauvoo, Illinois. Now this here is a picture of what we call a sacred grove. It was a grove of trees in which Joseph Smith, when he was 14 years old, and after having reading in James where it said, if anyone lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And this is where the boy went out to pray and ask the Lord which church he should join. And this is the grove of trees as it is today, where he offered that prayer. Now this other picture is a picture of the hill Cumorah, it was called. And this is the hill where Joseph Smith got the plates that had been buried there by Moroni centuries before. And now it's sort of a shrine as far as the church is concerned. And once a year they have a pageant there, which
retells the story of the restoration of the gospel.
Our ancestors were deeply religious people, and when they came to America, they came with the understanding in their hearts that they could worship as they pleased. But when they came to America, they came to religious confusion. The Quakers and especially were being given a hard time. And my ancestor, Edward Rawson, presided over the witchcraft trials in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was quite a tragic thing, the way these people were persecuted. So you'll find in this book here an account of some of the persecutions that those people went through. And then they found something else. They found that there were so many different religions, and they were all basing their belief on the Bible. Why is it? Why were there so many different Christian religions disputing with one another when they used the same record to substantiate the things that they believed? And so they were deeply religious people. They believed in prayer. They founded their lives upon prayer, praying to their Father in heaven for guidance and help and protection as they crossed the ocean on the Mayflower and other boats. And as they studied the scriptures, they found this, that it said that it is life eternal to know the only true God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent. And this gave them some thought, because the Christian religion in general really didn't believe in the Father and the Son as separate beings. In fact, they believed that the world was created out of nothing. And they also believed a God that was developed at a council in Nicaea 325 years after Christ was on the earth, when Constantine found that he was the ruler of all the land, and he decided that there'd just be one religion. He'd develop a universal church. And so he called all the wise men together at Nicaea in the year of 325. And the main thing on their agenda was to develop a type of God that they should worship. And while they were there were two of these leaders presented a case. One was Arius, who came up with the idea that the Father and the Son was definitely two different beings. Else, why did Christ pray to his Father? But Athanasius, who was the other one, he developed what was known as the Apostles' Creed, or the Athanasian Creed, which developed a three-in-one type of a being that was everywhere present yet nowhere present. And it was created out of nothing. And can you imagine, if you created out of nothing, what would you still have? You'd have nothing. And so this is what they came up with. And so our ancestors believed that the Father and the Son were separate beings. And this is one of the things that confused them, was that none of the churches taught that. So one of the next scriptures that concerned them was that in Amos it said that the Lord God would do nothing unless he revealed his secrets to his servants the prophets. And where was there a prophet? All during the Old Testament days there was prophets. All during Christ's ministry and afterward there was prophets. But where was the prophets now? And so they were concerned about finding a church that filled that void, or that what would you call it, statement. One of the things that concerned him very much was that where they came from, why they were here, and what happens when they died. Well, the church at the moment taught that this was the beginning of their existence when they came to this life. And we live this life, and if we are saved by the grace of God, or obedience to the rules of the church, that and confessed Christ as your personal Savior, no matter what you had done, you were saved and went to heaven. On the other hand, if you, no matter how good you were, if you wasn't saved by the grace of God, you went to hell. And this concerned them as one of the doctrines that was taught. One of the reasons I'm telling you this is that at the last 4 years of Mother's life, she was unable to get out, and she still liked to look nice, and so every weekend a neighbor lady, even named Jeannie Burgess, would come and do her hair. And they become very fast friends, and this Jeannie was just a wonderful person. And she was a very religious person in her own Protestant faith. And so Violet asked her to do her, when he asked her to do her hair, she found that she was on a very limited income, and at the end of the month, Violet would find out how much she owed and pay her bills, and so that's how much she paid her for doing her hair during the end of the month. And Jeannie just knew that she was just one of those special, wonderful people. And when Mother died, it broke Jeannie's heart, because Jeannie believed, and her preacher told her that she wasn't saved, that the Mormons weren't Christians, and she would wind up in hell, her best friend. And it just caused her no end of, sorrow to think that such a wonderful woman as Violet would wind up without being saved. And so this is what the doctrine was. Now you find in life that truth is reason. If a thing doesn't sound reasonable, you can really question its truth. At least it bears investigation. So does it seem reasonable that such a wonderful person as Violet would wind up in hell because she hadn't gone up to some preacher in some revival or other meeting and be saved? Just doesn't make any sense, does it? And so this was the same problem that faced our ancestors. They couldn't believe that, this doctrine that you had to be saved by the grace of God. Not only that, Presbyterians, they believed that some people were saved and some people weren't, that they were predestined to heaven or hell, and you couldn't do anything about it. And so there were so many different confusing doctrines at the time. And so there's little known in the Bible. There's a lot of things that aren't clear. For instance, where did we come from? And were we created out of nothing? Anything created out of nothing is just bound to wind up nothing, isn't it? And so doesn't that make sense, Bruce?
Mm-hmm.
And so they could believe this story of Joseph Smith, this boy, because it fell in line with reason, the things that he taught. There was a religious turmoil at the time. And they had a lot of unanswered questions, such as this: who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? And what happens when I die? And why is there so many different Christian churches all getting their answers from the same Bible? None of them understood the Bible the same way. And each of them was trying to get converts and convince the people that theirs was the true church. And our pioneer ancestors had inquiring minds, and they wanted to know too which church they should join. And so they were students of the Bible. And the first thing they found was the need of a prophet. In studying the Bible, they came to the conclusion that the church should have a prophet, a living prophet. Now each generation before, in the Old Testament days and the New Testament days, they had a prophet through which the Lord communicated his instructions. And in Amos 3 and 7, it reads, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secrets unto his servants the prophets." So in finding and studying this question, first question they asked, where in the church is the prophets? And there was none of the churches claimed to have a prophet at that time. I think one of the questions that the family would like to know is why did so many of our ancestors join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? It was the most unpopular religion in the world at that time, and yet our ancestors embraced the gospel. Why did they do it? Well, in the first place, they heard the story of Joseph Smith, this young boy, 14 years of age, who in reading James in the Bible said, "If anyone lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering." And so this boy read this, and he was convinced that the Lord would answer his prayers. He believed that God kept his promises, the promises made through his prophets here on the earth. And so in complete faith, this boy went out into the woods and he offered a prayer. And I hope that you'll read his story that's in the Book of Mormon and get a full account of what took place. Now, can you imagine a 14-year-old boy with little experience, never gone to school, hardly any, going out and offering prayer, and then coming back with this kind of a story? He said that while he was offering his prayer, why, he was seized by this great power that overpowered him, and he thought that he would be destroyed or something. And when he came to himself, why, there stood in the heavens two personages, and one of them introduced the other and said, "This is my beloved son, hear him." Now this is the first time that Joseph Smith had ever thought of the God, the Father, and his Son Jesus Christ in a way that they would have answered his prayer in person. But he went ahead and asked the question, which church am I going to join? And you can imagine his astonishment when Christ told him none of them, because he said their creeds are abomination, and that none of them were true, that the true gospel had been lost to the earth, and that as he grew older, he would eventually have the opportunity to restore the full gospel to the earth. Now, you can imagine how this boy felt that he was giving this assignment, 14 years of age, to someday restore the gospel to the earth, the full gospel to the earth. And so in amazement he went home and told his parents the story, you know, what had happened. And they believed him because they'd never known him to tell lies. And so he had the full support of his parents at the time. And he told the story, you'll read, if you read the story, read his account, he told the story of he told the story to a preacher who he thought was his friend. And this preacher laughed at him, you know, said it was from the devil, and start to ridicule him. And he couldn't understand why people would ridicule him for telling such a story, because it was true. And so he went along wondering what would happen next, and just living the life of a country boy, trying to make a living, working and helping build a home for his parents. And when he was 17 years old, one night, he offered a prayer. He was wondering, you know, what his next assignment would be. And he offered a prayer, and while he was praying, an angel came to him. And this angel told him that his name was Moroni, that he had buried the records of the ancient American people who had been visited by the Christ here on the American continent, and that he would need this record to use as a basis to organize the church, to bring it back to the earth. And they told him that if he'd come back there, that this angel told him that he would have that opportunity to translate that book. And now you can imagine a 17-year-old boy coming in with that kind of a story, that he'd be able to be commissioned to translate a record. And but anyway, he told that story around, and the angel Moroni took him to the hill upon which it was buried, and pried up a stone, and they showed him the plates. They were made of gold, or they were plates bound with rings. And he was told that he should come back there every year until he was given those plates. And so he came home with that story. Now, how are you going to believe a story like that? Either one of them. What, you know, a story like that, if it wasn't true, it would fade away. Nothing would ever come of it, wouldn't it? But we can only judge what happened by the evidence, judge the evidence by what happened, because the plates were given to him eventually when he was 20 years old, and he set about to translate them. The boy was given these plates, and when he did translate it, and he translated into this, what we know as the Book of Mormon, it's the history of the people who lived on ancient America, and people that Christ visited in the meridian of time after his crucifixion. These are the other sheep which Christ said he was going to visit, so there would be one fold and one shepherd. And so this Book of Mormon is really a concrete evidence that the story that Joseph Smith was true. Now, in regard to what he was told by the Father and the Son in his original, as an answer to his original prayer, I hope people just kind of can forgive my little bit of confusion. As I grow older, it's harder for me to really come up with the words to express the thoughts that I used to have when I was younger and a little bit sharper. But if you just understand in listening to this that I'm grasping for thoughts sometime, and it may not come as clear as it should be. But the Father and the Son appeared to this boy prophet, and they told him that not only would he restore the gospel based upon a living prophet and apostles and a definite organization, but that he would usher in the last dispensation of the fullness of times, and that it would be the beginning of the restoration of all things. Now, the years from 325, the year 325, when Constantine and this group of philosophers got together and developed the kind of God that they wanted to worship, you'll remember what happened. The Dark Ages occurred, and we had 1,500 years of darkness, of years without light of the gospel on the earth, of years without understanding the nature of God. They were worshiping something that didn't exist. Something was everywhere yet nowhere. And so during that period of time, darkness covered the earth because there was no prophet on the earth through which the Lord could communicate his will. And so that's what's happening during that period of time. But in the 15th century, the light started to break through, and men like Luther and Calvin and Knox and Zwingli and some of these other reformers, they started to question the doctrine of the church. Even old King Henry VIII, you know, he got it out of the church. He got behind on his Peter Pants and Pope, and he wanted to get a divorce from Catherine so he could marry this beautiful Anne Boleyn over in France, but the Pope wouldn't give him his divorce. And so he says, to heck with you, I'll start a church of my own. And so Henry VIII started the Church of England. And they became as big a tyrants as the Catholic Church was. And this is why John Lathrop, who is one of your ancestors, who you have an account of in those records that I've shown you, why he organized a group of free-thinkers to try to understand what the real truth of the gospel was. But if it hadn't have been for these men, these reformers, these people who questioned the authority of the Catholic Church, why the church here could have never really been established, because the pilgrims and those other people who came for religious freedom wouldn't have understood just what what was in store for them as they went about searching for the truth. Now we truly appreciate what those great reformers did, because they were the ones who broke away to come to America. They didn't know that this was a promised land above all other lands, and the Lord reserved this land as a place to establish the church. He told the people who lived here in ancient America that as long as they served him, they'd prosper in the land. But when they ceased serving him, they would be cut off. And so this is what happened to the ancient people who lived in America when they killed the prophets and broke up the church. Why, it was the end of their really civilized nation. Now, all these things put together, you know, are evidence that the boy prophet was telling the truth. But not only that, what evidence we have that the church was restored in its fullness is that it is active and carrying on its work in more than 150 nations of the world. The Book of Mormon has been translated into millions and millions of copies, and we have millions of members of the church scattered throughout the world. And would any of this happen if the boy had just made up a story? Do you really believe that he could have foreseen all of this when he told his parents and the neighbors that he'd been destined or commissioned to restore the church? Could anyone have imagined it would come true? If it didn't come true, they would just dismiss his story as a fabrication. But it wasn't a fabrication, it was true. And our ancestors, as they became involved in the church, why, in the first place, they gave it a test. They read the Book of Mormon and studied the Book of Mormon. And after they had read it and studied it, they listened to that last verse in the Book of Mormon where it said, let him, anyone who wanted to know the truth of this book was to offer a prayer, and the Lord would reveal to them by the power of the Holy Spirit that this church was true. You know, when I was a boy, young boy, my brothers and I used to sleep on a haystack. And I don't know if any of you would know now what a haystack is, but in those days we put up long hay and we'd build it into a high stack of loose hay. And we'd get up and sleep on this top of this haystack mainly to get out of the mosquitoes, because mosquitoes don't fly as high as very high off the ground. And so at night, while we'd lay out on that haystack, and we'd look up at the stars, you know, and we'd look around to try to find the North Star. And we knew how we could find it was by looking at the two end stars on the Big Dipper, and that's how we found the North Star. And as we would look at the star, we'd wonder how far it was out there. You know, where does it end? Is there an end out there? Where does it stop? That way, or up or down? And we realized that there was no end. There's no place to stop. That our world was just like an atom in the center of it all here, because there was just absolutely no place to stop. Then if you put that same thought in time, we would talk about it. When did time start? And we realized that there was no time for it to start. What was before it was start, you know? And so we realized that both time and space had no beginning or no end. Now we wondered, where do we fit into this great picture? Were we ever nothing? Did you ever stop and think of that? Were we ever nothing? Were we created out of nothing? And you realize that nothing created out of would never create into something. And so we never had a beginning or an end. Whatever we are existed out there forever. Well, I just passed my 92nd birthday, and this gives me a lot of time for reflection. Think that I've lived that many years, and as I look back upon life, one of the most important questions that I've had throughout my life is just, who am I and what is my place on this earth, and what is expected of me? And these were questions that I had when I was just a young boy. And I loved to study the scriptures, and I used that probably as the basis of most of my study, because I didn't go to school much, and I would just love to read the Psalms and the Proverbs and the story of Christ. And I decided I'd just study the scripture and mix it with faith and sound reason to see what I could get out of it. And one of the things that gave me the biggest question was not only what the Bible said, but what it didn't say. You know, there are so many unanswered questions in the Bible, and I thought the most important thing was to find an answer to those questions. And one of the most interesting things that I found was that we only have about 35 days of Christ's ministry in the New Testament. And I never really thought of it before that at the age of 12, he was confounding the wise men in the temple. And he said when his parents came to pick him up, he said, "Know ye not that I should be about my Father's business?" And so if Jesus was confounding the wise men in the temple when he was 12 years old, and we only have the record of what happened to him after he was 36 years old. So what happened to those years in between? He must have had a great experience and done some great teaching among the people. But because we only have that many days of his ministry, we don't get a complete picture. For instance, when he called his disciples, his apostles, this is really the first picture we have of his kingdom, what it was like. And we only have a picture of him calling his apostles and what he expected them to do. There's nothing more said about the organization of the church, just what kind of a kingdom he was establishing here on earth, except the few details that Paul gave when he said that we'd have a church based upon apostles and prophets and elders and 70s and high priests, and it would endure till we all come to a unity of the faith. Christ said to his apostles in John 17:3, "This is life eternal, to know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom he has sent." Now, isn't that very clear? It's life eternal to know them. That is important, I believe, in our life, to know the true and living God. Because in the Exodus it said, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." What did he mean when he said that? You know, I realize that I'm at just about the end of my rope when you're 92 years old and you're failing in a lot of places. You can feel it, and you know that you haven't long to live. I'd like to tell you, if it would be on my deathbed, that I know that the church is true, and that I know that we as a family will be able to live together in his kingdom hereafter if we make an effort to live up to the standards and the laws which he has given us. I have spent most of my life serving in the church, and serving without compensation other than the blessing I received from living the commandments of God. And I have made many mistakes in life, and I'm grateful for the law of repentance that has made it possible for me to be assured that I can leave this life with a fairly clean slate. As you go through this little folder and you read some of the things that our ancestors believed, you will have a better understanding, or will be able to understand the things that I have had in my mind that puzzled me and that I found an answer for in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The greatest blessing that I have uncovered in my study of the Scriptures and the Book of Mormon and the doctrine of the church is that the family will be the basis of life hereafter. That I can continue my relationship with my family and with my wife. You know, if Violet had lived another 2 months, we'd have been married 69 years. And those were beautiful years. And to think that that would be an end of our relationship would just be heartbreaking. But when I studied the gospel and found that life was eternal, that men and women were both come forth in the resurrection. And doesn't it make sense if they came forth at the resurrection, that the family will be the basis of life hereafter? And I think that one of the greatest and most important things in my life is that I know that the church is true, that Joseph Smith was truly a prophet of God, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that he is a personal being, and that God the Father is a personal being, and that we will, if we live well enough or good enough, or we will be able to live with him in his kingdom hereafter. That is our answer to the question, what does it mean to be saved? To be saved means to live up to his teachings well enough that we can be welcomed in his kingdom hereafter. You know, I never planned to be a religious leader in my time. I was just a barefoot, runny-nosed homesteader's kid, you know, without an education. And I never dreamed that I would have the opportunity and the responsibility to head the organizations that I've headed in the church. And I know that throughout my life that I never had the natural ability to do the things that I was called upon to do. And so many times I know that I've been guided by the Spirit to direct the activities and the affairs of the wards and the states which I've had the opportunity to work with. And I know this is true. It has added so much to my life. And every thing that I've done in life has been centered around the things that the gospel has taught me and has done for me. And it has enriched my life more than you ever know. Now there's one little thing that might help you to understand the law of tithing. You think it was enough to devote all your time without pay to fill an office in the church, but before you were called in an office, you had to have faith enough to church to be a tithe payer, to pay with 1/10 of your income to the church. And I've been in a position throughout most of my life, the life as I was active in the church, to know the difference between the success of people who paid their tithing and those who didn't. And I have found that those who paid 10% of their income to the church and not only paid their tithing but donated their time were able to meet their obligations. And the Lord promised that if we would do that, he would open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing we couldn't be able to receive. And it's my testimony, and I've tried to pay my tithing all my life. Maybe people think I was foolish, but you know, I've always had the means to pay it, and I've always had the means to meet my obligations. And all my life I have never left one bill unpaid that I know about. And that is one of the great blessings that I'm sure has come to my life. through my activity in the church and my observance of the law of tithing. You've listened to the things that I've said on this tape, and I know that they are true. I know the gospel is true. It is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ upon the earth. And it is my testimony that that is true. And I know that Joseph Smith is truly a prophet of the living God, and that we have a living prophet on the church, in the church today, to help us meet the challenges of the times. That's why it's so necessary to have a living prophet to guide our activities, because we live in such a changing world, and we need an up-to-date prophet. Can't understand why people can believe in dead prophets and yet not believe in living ones. So I just hope that you will investigate the church, if you aren't already members of it, that you will offer a prayer, ask the Lord if it is true. And I know that if you do this, that the Lord will reveal to you, as he has to me, the truthfulness of the gospel, because I know that it's true. And I pray the Lord will bless us all in carrying out his work. And I say it humbly in Jesus' name, amen.